John, you have been a PanTech Fellow in Korean Studies at Stanford University. On December 23rd, 2020, you wrote the article Biden's Approach to North Korea and the NPT Option. What shape will the new administration's policy toward North Korea take based on the records of President-elect Biden and his advisors? And could you please explain what you mean by NPT option?
Sure. So in terms of what we might expect from the Biden administration, obviously the Obama administration, and Biden was vice president at that time, did not have a very successful approach to North Korea. There was an initial long review of North Korea policy, which really was the first misstep, because there was really some momentum at the end of the George W. Bush administration to negotiate with North Korea. This is prior to North Korea actually officially becoming a nuclear power. And the incoming Obama administration wasted that opportunity by engaging in a long review process and not picking up the diplomatic opportunity. There was early on a Leap Day agreement, something that took place on Leap Day, end of February, that didn't last. And that was basically the end of diplomatic overtures to North Korea. And the Obama administration settled into something it called, or it was called for it, strategic patience, which was a nice way of saying that basically the Obama administration would ignore North Korea and hope that the problem would resolve itself somehow. And the problem didn't resolve itself. North Korea basically moved full speed ahead on acquiring nuclear weapons. The Biden administration probably doesn't have a much better worked out plan than the Obama administration had. I don't think it will continue really much of what Donald Trump attempted with his personal diplomacy with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. But there is a possibility, given some of the statements that Antony Blinken, the nominee for Secretary of State, has made over the years, that the Biden administration will go back to a kind of step-by-step approach with North Korea. Instead of, in other words, asking North Korea to get rid of its nuclear weapons, denuclearize, and then the United States will consider lifting sanctions and other measures, that there will be a kind of step-by-step reduction of sanctions, reduction of North Korea's nuclear capacity, with the hope that gradually the countries can move closer toward what might be a zero option. In other words, zero sanctions and zero nuclear weapons. Which brings me to the NPT option. So NPT is the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. And the NPT treaty basically was a bargain between the nuclear powers and the non-nuclear powers. The nuclear powers said, we will eventually give up our nuclear weapons, number one. And number two, we will provide you non-nuclear countries, with the capacity for civilian nuclear power, the so-called Atoms for Peace program. And in exchange, you, non-nuclear countries, will forswear or say you will never have nuclear weapons. And so that's the deal. And it's been a successful treaty in the sense that it has more or less prevented widespread proliferation of nuclear weapons. Of course, some countries nevertheless went ahead. They either didn't sign the NPT or they broke their pledge. Israel, India, Pakistan, obviously North Korea. But, it did prevent more widespread distribution of nuclear weapons around the world. At the same time, those countries did receive this opportunity to have civilian nuclear power plants. What didn't happen, of course, is that the nuclear powers did not give up their nuclear programs. I mean, the United States, Russia, China, France, UK have basically, I mean, obviously the United States and Russia have somewhat smaller arsenals than they did because of arms control measures, but you know, in the grand scheme of things, we have just as many nuclear weapons as we did at the signing of the NPT, enough to destroy the world many times over. Okay, so why would I even consider such a flawed bargain for North Korea? Well, here's the key. The key is a kind of acknowledgement that North Korea has nuclear weapons and that it will eventually give up those nuclear weapons without setting a timeline on what that disarmament will look like. And similar to the pledge by nuclear powers in the NPT to give up their nuclear weapons, but without a timeline. And in exchange, the United States and North Korea will again engage in that step-by-step reduction, which one hopes is, you know, the plan for the Biden administration, but with one additional twist. Under the NPT, other countries were offered civilian nuclear power, and you know, nuclear energy was considered an important part of modernization, of ways for countries to catch up, to fuel their economies in the absence of oil and other fossil fuels. North Korea also does not really have any fossil fuels, no oil, no natural gas. It has some coal, yes, but not a huge amount. And in addition, North Korea is very far behind South Korea, economically speaking. Basically, it's the difference between Germany and Ghana. You know, that's if Germany and Ghana were on the same peninsula, that's what you would have with North Korea and South Korea. So North Korea has a lot of economic development it wants to do, but it doesn't really have the energy capacity to fuel that economic development. So I don't, you know, the agreed framework in the 1990s was an effort to provide them with that civilian nuclear power to help with economic development, and those nuclear power plants were never built. These days, I would propose an entirely different option, and that would be a clean energy option, that the United States work with North Korea and perhaps other countries, China and South Korea, for instance, in building up North Korea's clean energy capacity, whether we're talking about solar or wind, a variety of other clean energy sources. Because North Korea actually has a very, very small carbon footprint right now. And I think that it has a kind of clean energy advantage over South Korea at the moment because of that small carbon footprint. And that should be the point of pride that can substitute for nuclear weapons for North Korea. I mean, nuclear weapons mean a great deal to North Korea because of the prestige that nuclear weapons confer to a country. So to get rid of those nuclear weapons, not only are you getting rid of North Korea's deterrent capability, you're getting rid of that prestige. Now, a clean energy alternative is not going to provide a deterrent, obviously, a security deterrent. That has to be provided in other ways, through a peace treaty, through non-aggression pact, etc. But it can provide prestige. I mean, if North Korea can say, we have the most modern energy economy in the world, the smallest carbon footprint, we are ahead of South Korea. We are ahead of other countries per capita. That could be a major point of pride. So that's the NPT deal, a acknowledgement of North Korea's nuclear program and its eventual disarmament, but not according to a specific timeline, step-by-step reductions, arms control in exchange for sanctions reduction, and the provision of a clean energy alternative.
If that happens and North Korea no longer has nuclear weapons, how can it be sure United States will not one way or another overthrow the government in the name of human rights, for example, the way it happened in Libya? And why is a nuclear-armed North Korea a problem? Everyone lives with the United States that refuses to adopt a no first use policy.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, those are both good questions. So let's take the first one. How can North Korea be assured that it won't be overthrown, that the current regime won't be overthrown if it doesn't have this deterrent capability of nuclear weapons? Number one, North Korea has a pretty robust conventional military force. Big army, lots of weapons, many of them very close to the DMZ. In other words, even without nuclear weapons, North Korea is a military threat. And it's a military threat because of proximity, not just because of the quantity or quality of their arms. It's proximity to Seoul. I mean, it can destroy Seoul pretty quickly. And that's something South Korea doesn't want to happen. 20 million people living in the greater Seoul area. And it's also not something that the United States wants to happen. So that conventional force did serve as sufficient deterrent prior to North Korea having nuclear weapons and can serve that function in the future. One would also hope that eventually you would have the kind of situation in which North Korea is so well integrated into regional and global politics and economy that there would be no point for the United States to try to overthrow it. In other words, there would be US investment, South Korean investment, Chinese investment in North Korea, and it would effectively be self-defeating for any outside power to try to attack North Korea, because it would be attacking its own businesses and et cetera. So for those two reasons, I think, in addition to the more conventional response, which is there would be a new peace treaty, there would be a non-aggression pact signed. Well, if I were North Korea, I wouldn't care so much about words on paper. I would want something that was a little bit more effective in terms of a deterrent. And so that's why I emphasize its conventional military and potential economic integration as sufficient deterrents. Now, the second question, why should we care about North Korea's nuclear weapons? I mean, that's a really good point. And I've made it many times, not with respect to the United States, but with respect to China. China's had a nuclear arsenal since basically 1965. And the United States didn't care very much about China's nuclear weapons when it negotiated détente with China at the end of the 1960s and into the 1970s. And China was, frankly, in a much more destabilizing place in terms of its own country and in terms of the region as a result of the Cultural Revolution than North Korea is today. And yet we still negotiated with China, and we came up with a pretty strong economic relationship with the country, even though it had nuclear weapons. In other words, what we decided was it doesn't matter that China has nuclear weapons as long as China doesn't have any incentive to use nuclear weapons. If China is integrated into the world, there's absolutely no reason why we would worry about China using its nuclear weapons. And indeed, when was the last time anybody talked about the threat of China's nuclear weapons? Yeah, we talk about Chinese threats in other ways, with 5G networks, South China Sea, intellectual property rights, resource extraction in Africa. Yeah, but do people talk about China actually launching nuclear weapons against Germany or the United States? No, no one really worries about that. And I would imagine ultimately that's how we should look at North Korea's nuclear potential as well. That as long as North Korea is integrated into the world economy, politics, society, we'll stop worrying about North Korea's nuclear weapons. There's one last thing that I would put forward, both as a potential deterrent, but also as a fallback option for North Korea, and that is this notion of a recessed deterrent. It's something that Japan has. In other words, Japan does not have nuclear weapons, But it does have the capability of acquiring nuclear weapons very quickly. It has enough material to do so. It has the skill set, the capability to fashion warheads and deliverable nuclear weapon within only a couple of months. So a final deterrent that North Korea could fall back upon is such a recessed deterrent. Even if it formally gives up its nuclear arsenal, it could maintain this recessed deterrent. But again, whether it's a functioning nuclear arsenal or a recessed deterrent, there's no reason to worry about what North Korea does if we have a pattern of relationships with North Korea. And North Korea is inextricably bound into the world around it, such that the use of nuclear weapons would be literally self-defeating for North Korea.
According to a Lancet study, there was a significant increase in mortality in the 90s in Russia. The way North Korea would be bound, would North Korea effectively become colony of its neighbors, subservient to the US, and up to whatever the United States decides to do with it. Is that concern reasonable? Do they have to fear that?
How I'm not sure I understand the connection to the mortality rates in Russia, though.
Well, will the United States and its allies introduce an economic program of neoliberalization that will have a negative impact on the population of North Korea, something that happened after the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
The United States won, and
well, at the moment, the situation between the Soviet Union circa 1991 and North Korea today are pretty different in the sense that the Soviet Union had a very well-educated population, pretty strong infrastructure, although obviously it was in not the greatest shape, but and a GDP that was that was pretty significant. I mean, Russia was Soviet Union as of 1991, but Russia in the prior to the neoliberal reforms of Yeltsin, et cetera, it was still producing a good amount of material. I mean, there was oil, natural gas, armaments, obviously. Russia still had exports that the world wanted to buy. Okay, the world didn't want to buy Russian textiles, maybe, so there was a kind of collapse of Russian textile and some commercial goods, but there were still things that Russia was selling. And there was a lot of wealth inside Russia, an enormous amount of wealth. And so the 1990s in Russia was not just neoliberalism in terms of reduction of the government, the privatization of the state enterprises, but it was also the extraction of wealth from the country, often by Russians themselves, parking huge amounts of money in foreign banks. But anyway, there was a tremendous sourcing of Russian wealth. North Korea doesn't have that kind of wealth. And I am, of course, concerned about what might happen economically inside North Korea. But at the moment, it's not a piggy bank that the neoliberals would hit and then take the money out, because there's really no money inside North Korea. I mean, it's one of the reasons why it's been so difficult for North Korea to prosper economically. I mean, yes, there are economic sanctions, but even without economic sanctions, companies, corporations have just not been interested in investing in North Korea. There's not a lot of reason to do so. I mean, with some exceptions, animation companies. There have been a couple of textile, mostly with assembly on site rather than production of the clothes. So there are some exceptions, but not a lot of profit to be made in North Korea. What it means is that North Korea has had North Korea doesn't care about capital. I mean, the North Korean leadership, they have no ideological problems with capitalism or neoliberalism for that matter. What their concern has been always is government control of the economy. And their concern about capitalism is the potential for other sources of power that might exist outside the North Korean state, that might arise within North Korea. So that's their major concern. Capitalism as an ideology or as a system, they don't really care about. For instance, there are markets all throughout North Korea that the state tolerates because the state food distribution system broke down. But it also tolerates it because it can extract taxes from the sellers in the market. So it's become a very official and profitable and lucrative system for everybody concerned. Well, not everybody, because there are still a lot of poor people in North Korea, but for the marketeers and for the state. Okay, so the fact that North Korea is not this big, attractive object. Oh, and I should mention, North Korea is only 20 million people. I mean, it's a very small country. It's a tiny population. So it's not a huge workforce, and it's also not a huge consumer market, which is another reason why outside investors are not so excited about it. Nevertheless, having said all that, what might happen going forward, let's say the North Korean state decides that let's say that there is this kind of step-by-step reduction of sanctions and of North Korea's nuclear program, and North Korea becomes more integrated, shall we say, into the global economy. North Korea will have a choice. It can either become a kind of very low-end source of manufacturing of the dirtiest kind, the kind of the bottom of the Asian manufacturing hub, or it can leverage its position as China and Vietnam have done as communist countries, or at least as nominally communist countries, and work their way up the supply chain and the value added production scale, so that they are, above Laos, for instance, or above Mongolia. And North Korea uses its highly educated population, its technical expertise, especially in computers, IT sector, and some of the connections that it has already made with the outside world, and including Vietnam, Singapore, et cetera, to rise higher in that. So I think that's kind of choice probably that North Korea faces. That will still leave a significant chunk of the population very poor, unfortunately. This is a kind of, in either case, it's a kind of talented 10th approach. In other words, about a 10th of the population will prosper, and the other 90% will not do so well. And that won't change because, I don't really think that the government cares that much about, a huge increase in prosperity for everyone in the country. I mean, it has been focused largely on the expert class for the last 20 years or so. I mean, it was different back in the 50s or in the 1960s, but certainly since the beginning of the 21st century, that has been the strategy. And Kim Jong-un seems perfectly happy to continue a focus on improving the lives of the expert class. The group that has, already transitioned to a market economy and engage in foreign trade with bribes to state officials, etc. So that's kind of the future as I see it.
Thank you very much for this interview, John.
It's been a pleasure. I hope it's been useful.
Yes, very much.